Edgar Allan Poe is one of America's most esteemed writers to ever grace the paper with pen. Poe was a prolific poet and author in the 19th century who is credited with pioneering the detective thriller genre and influencing future generations of poets around the world. But despite his literary acclaim, Poe led an often troubled and macabre life and died early in 1849 at a mere 40 years old. The bizarre circumstances relating to the death of the captivating writer have led to a whole range of exhilarating and convincing theories. Yet the exact cause remains a cold case to this day. Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston in 1809. His father left the family in 1810, and his mother died in 1811, leading to his adoption by a wealthy merchant family and his presumed godfather. He led a somewhat transient childhood, spending time being educated in Britain before coming back to the States to study at the University of Virginia. Though his adoptive father had sent him off for his studies with only a third of the funds necessary. It was thus from his early adulthood that Poe began to show signs of sporadic behavior, which was to trouble him throughout much of his life. He was soon incurring gambling debts as he attempted to win the rest of his tuition using the little funds his godfather had provided. This eventually led to him leaving university and joining the army in a desperate attempt to simply stay fed and clothed. As for his personal passions, Poe began writing poems when he was 18, and his genius was immediately apparent. He was soon being published in journals and newspapers, and finally gaining some financial stability. However, also becoming readily apparent was his inability to control his drinking, and the alcohol began to take an ugly hold of Poe's life. He was fired from jobs and frequently seen in drunken stupors at public drinking houses. Making matters worse, it's been reported that a single glass of wine could leave the grim author stumbling and struggling to speak coherently. It seemed like alcohol was both his Achilles heel and his crutch. As with many poets of his day and Annie, EAP's life was marred with cataclysm as well. After his fiancée left him to be engaged to another man while Poe was away for studies, the heartbroken storyteller soon went on to marry his younger cousin, when she was 13 and he was 27. And as if the man hadn't suffered enough, Poe's new wife died in 1847, rubbing salt in an ever-open wound. She had provided the strength and support that he had so desperately needed, and without her, he fell into even more heavy periods of drinking and drifting. On September 27th of 1849, a beaten down and traumatized Poe, newly re-engaged to his first fiancée, left Richmond, Virginia, to make way for Philadelphia. What happened over the following days led to his death, but is forever shrouded in mystery. Poe was discovered by printer Joseph Walker on October 3rd in Baltimore after seemingly disappearing. He was found in a street gutter outside Gunner's Hall Tavern on Election Day. The tavern, curiously, was actively being used as a polling booth. The wandering poet was in a seriously worrying state, babbling, semi-conscious, seemingly in great distress, clothed in poorly fitting apparel that could hardly be his own. He was thus taken to Washington College Hospital, where he continued to drift in and out of consciousness, often slipping into bouts of hallucinations. At times, Poe mumbled what could only be made out to be the name Reynolds, although who this person was is unknown. After an eerie few days during which the troubled writer was never able to gain enough coherency to explain even what had occurred to him, on the morning of October 7th, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe was declared dead. His finals were reported to have been, "Lord help my poor soul." Doctors at the time put the cause of death down to cerebral inflammation, which is a way of saying, "I'm sorry, but we have no idea," or possibly a polite way of his day to point to severe alcohol poisoning. Fittingly, Poe's demise was theorized by his contemporaries to have been brought about by either alcohol poisoning or some form of seizure. But ever since that fateful day, plenty of other guesses have emerged as to what led Edgar Allan Poe to be nevermore. Some such hypotheses are plausible and others not. some facts are worth considering. Firstly, Poe was found in a semi-conscious state outside of a tavern. It was election time in Baltimore, and the site was used to poll votes. Poe was also strangely dressed. He was wearing ill-fitting and cheap clothes that were very different in style and size from what he'd normally wear. Furthermore, Poe had a history of not only heavy drinking, but a ridiculously low tolerance for alcohol. This meant that when he consumed alcohol, he became blackout drunk. But what does that mean for the poet's killer? One often cited theory for Poe's death is rabies. A Maryland doctor was one of several medics to check and determine the cause of death. Rabies was a common virus in the 1800s, and the author had shown minimal, but nevertheless some, symptoms of the disease. These included heart palpitations and delirium. However, this doesn't account for Poe's odd choice of dress, or his showing no signs of rabies before leaving Virginia. Nor does it explain why he was found on election day at a tavern and polling site. So while convincing when fully embraced, circumstantial evidence likely rules out the rabies theory. Another suggested cause of death is a brain tumor, which may have little more of a leg to stand on. This idea became widely accepted after Poe's body was removed from its original grave in order to be buried in a place of honor. A small mass was found inside of the deteriorating skull, triggering newfound interest in the accepted cold case. Brains decompose quickly, despite many claiming that this tiny, hard mass clunking around the poet's brain, thus prompting some to claim it to be a tumor. Again, this seems unlikely, as Poe has shown no previous symptoms of a tumor, except that it had been claimed that EAP at one point had been informed by a physician that there was some type of lesion on his brain, possibly being the cause of his extreme intolerance to alcohol. But this still leads a vast number of amateur and professional sleuths alike to believe that the most likely cause of Poe's death was, in fact, alcohol poisoning. We know that the unsettled orphan struggled with alcohol abuse throughout his life, and that he, when intoxicated, often became incoherent and disoriented very rapidly. We also know that, in his final days, he showed signs of severe alcohol withdrawal, such as delirium, shaking, and hallucinations. The sorry state that he was found in while laying on the street gutter could furthermore be caused by a fierce level of intoxication. But that begs the question. Did he drink himself into such a state willingly, or was he compelled by someone else to drink his life away in a single night? If the latter proved true, it would mean at the very least, manslaughter. It's a hefty accusation, but the biggest clue we have is where he was found, when he was found, and what he was wearing. Outside a polling booth on election day in someone else's clothes. Suspicious is putting it lightly. In the 19th century and subsequently, in Poe's final, dreary days, criminal gangs would carry out a violent form of electoral fraud known as cooping. Cooping involved abducting someone and forcing them to vote against their will at several polling booths for a specific candidate. Victims were usually forced to consume massive quantities of liquor to become compliant, and then they were left somewhere on the streets when the endeavor was finished. The term cooping refers to the act of keeping the victims cooped up in a room where they would have their appearances altered and fed drink after drink. Changing appearances could often mean shaving off beards or cutting their hair, but it also involved changing the person's clothes. These criminal gangs had no time to dress their victims. They certainly had no need to dress their victims in any fancy, properly fit threads. Cheap or second-hand clothes were the go-to. Just what Poe had been wearing when he was found in the Baltimore streets. Poe's disappearance also occurred in the middle of an election in Baltimore. Cooping was notably a common practice in Baltimore at the time, and easily explains why the famed writer was found outside of a polling station. And ironically, in Poe's situation, cooping victims were also often awarded with booze after being forced to vote as a way to be thanked for their services, whether they wanted it or not. So, again, what does all of this mean for the mystery of Edgar Allan Poe's cause of death? Every single aspect of how the damaged author was found can be justified by a victim of cooping, and vice versa. And to make this theory even more compelling, Poe having been used for this grisly form of voter fraud would lend credibility to the conclusion that it was alcohol poisoning that had brought the fall of the prominent poet. Even more, Baltimore would have been beginning to get cold in early October. A man with a history of alcoholic blackouts would have been in serious trouble on the chilly streets, inadequately dressed and with toxic level of alcohols in the system. And another theory that can furthermore bolster the rest. Poe also was warned against traveling to Philadelphia by his doctor, as he showed signs of coming down with the flu. This would have only added to a weakened immune system and inability to deal with massive alcohol consumption. Thus, of all the theories surrounding Poe's death, alcohol poisoning because of cooping seems to be the telltale conclusion. A dreadful form of manslaughter. Murder, even. But can we be certain? Ultimately, the cause of Edgar Allan Poe's demise will always remain a secret that went with him to the grave. We'll never know the exact details of his final days on this puzzling planet. Try as we might to uncover the truth, the mask of the poet's death will forever remain. It's ironic that the much-lauded inventor of detective mystery stories and the creator of the grotesque and arabesque would himself die under bewildering and hard-to-explain circumstances. The architect of stories surrounding mystery and murder, it seems that Edgar Allan Poe died as one of his own characters within the anomalous world that he spawned. Almost like a dream within a dream.